One US state makes it illegal to discriminate against the homeless, but dozens of cities across the country are going in the opposite direction. How does America treat its most vulnerable? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu. The US state of Rhode Island is the first in the country to pass a Bill of Rights for the homeless. The law gives them equal rights to jobs, housing and public space. But as Rhode Island moves to protect the rights of the homeless, more than 50 cities across the country have adopted laws that make it illegal to sleep, sit, beg or share food in public areas. Supporters say it's a matter of public health and safety. But human rights advocates disagree, saying such legislation leaves the homeless with nowhere to eat or sleep. The issue has caught the attention of the White House, which is criticizing measures that would criminalize homelessness. The federal government feels these steps would not solve the problem, but simply reduce the visibility of the homeless in cities and towns across the country. Kath Turner reports.
At the soup kitchen inside Rhode Island's State House, they're celebrating.
Thank you very much.
Months of campaigning have paid off with a Bill of Rights for the state's homeless.
That they can say to someone, you know what, I'm going to sue you. I'm going to bring charges up against you because you're not giving me the opportunity to ride that bus or have an opportunity at the job.
The law gives the homeless protection and equal rights to housing, health services, jobs and public space.
You need to prosecute someone in order to make a stand and make someone be aware that they're not going to tolerate this.
But at a shelter across town, the mood couldn't be more different. Conditions inside Harrington Hall are miserable. The heat is stifling, there's no air conditioning, and there are 3 bathrooms for more than 100 men. The atmosphere is tense. Many suffer from mental illness and drug and alcohol addiction. Arguments break out with the men threatening to hurt each other and themselves. Rupert Lupon spent 18 years in jail and has been homeless for more than 5. He's not relying on any law to protect him.
I can't worry about the people in the State House. I can't worry about bills being passed. I have to make it happen.
And while the law may empower the homeless, the constant prejudice they face will be hard to overcome. The Bill of Rights is supposed to stop people from discriminating against homeless people. But in the short time that I've been here, several people, both homeless and from advocacy groups, have told me that bus drivers along this stretch of road often refuse to pick up people from this bus stop, simply because it's right outside the homeless shelter. It's going to take more than legislation to stop that kind of behaviour. Opponents of the law say it's misguided, feel-good politics. Dan Gordon voted against it because he thinks the resulting litigation will clog up the courts without creating opportunities.
We need to bring jobs here. We need to create, through legislation, a more friendly business environment through deregulation, less taxation, and then things will take their natural course.
Rhode Island's approach is running against the tide. Dozens of cities and a handful of US states want to make homelessness illegal, and some would even ban donations to shelters. Back at Harrington Hall, the solution is seemingly simple.
The answer to homelessness isn't the Bill of Rights. I think the answer is more affordable housing.
But no matter what laws are in place, putting a permanent roof over the heads of those here remains as elusive as ever. Kath Turner, Al Jazeera, Providence, Rhode Island.
So what should be done to improve the lives of the homeless in the United States? Joining us is Jeremy Rosen, the Policy Director of the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty, Jim Reisig, the Executive Director of the Rhode Island Coalition for the Homeless, and Neil Bomberg, the Program Director for Human Development and Public Safety at the National League of Cities. Gentlemen, thanks to all of you for joining us. First, let's take a look at this initiative by Rhode Island to introduce a Bill of Rights for the homeless. Now, there have been arguments, as we've seen in that report, for and against this measure. Jeremy, is Rhode Island onto something here?
Absolutely. This is a very important first step in terms of protecting the legal rights of people who are homeless in this country. It's certainly not going to be in and of itself a solution to homelessness. It's not going to provide us with the affordable housing and the jobs that we need to end homelessness for everyone in this country. But we hope and expect that this will serve as a positive model for communities rather than what many cities are doing right now, which is to pass negative measures that are seeking to move people out of public spaces, but which wind up really being costly for communities and don't actually address the root causes of homelessness.
Okay, I want to go to Jim Rysak in a moment, but first let's try and put a human face to the problem of homelessness in the United States. Earlier I spoke to Eric Sheptock. He's an advocate for the homeless. He's himself homeless. I spoke to him probably about 24 blocks from where we are right now, right here in central Washington, very close to the shelter where he lives. Let's take a look at what he had to say. So, Eric, how long is it since you've been homeless?
Well, I first became homeless in 1994. Since then, I've gotten out several times and fallen back in. But the thing of it, though, is that I've been working most of the time that I've been homeless. But oftentimes, a person doesn't make a living wage. They don't make enough money to pay for their own rent. You know, which kind of brings us to the issue of D.C., where the average rent for a two-bedroom is $1,600 a month. You'd have to make about $64,000 a year, or $32 an hour, but the minimum wage here is $8.25. So you have bosses that are paying people a quarter of what it takes to live here.
All right. Now, how do you manage for things like food and clothing and your daily expenses?
Well, thank God there are a lot of do-gooders here in D.C. There are people who come to the parks and feed the homeless and give out clothing. I stay in this shelter here. This building to my left holds 1,350 homeless people. And then I go to a feeding program in the morning that feeds the homeless. But the other side of that, though, is that because of my advocacy, there are meetings that oftentimes take place early in the morning, and I actually have to skip breakfast in order to go to those events.
Well, it's going to get to a situation now where you're going to actually need a permit to distribute food in public spaces like parks and things like that. So homeless people are going to have a lot of difficulty finding that.
Right. I've lived in Orlando where I know that people from Food Not Bombs were arrested. About 24 of them were arrested last year for feeding the homeless in the park, in Lake Eola Park, where I've been plenty of times. The rule is you can get 2 permits per year and you can feed 25 people or less.
That was homeless advocate Eric Sheptock talking to me earlier. Let's go to Jim Rysak. Jim, what about those who make the argument that introducing something like a Bill of Rights for the homeless, like Rhode Island has done, actually sidesteps the issue? It's not getting to the root of the problem, which is finding out why people are homeless in the first place.
Well, I wholeheartedly agree with that assessment, actually. And the Homeless Bill of Rights in Rhode Island was not a standalone piece of legislation during our legislative session this year. We had a comprehensive set of legislation that we were trying to pass, which included a dedicated funding stream for affordable housing production and homeless prevention, an affordable housing bond to go on the ballot in November for voter approval, and a plethora of other things that would help poor people make ends meet easier. But the Homeless Bill of Rights was one of those things, and as legislation goes, it was one of the things that passed this session in the General Assembly, because homeless people themselves in Rhode Island were part of the calculus in lobbying for that specific law in our state.
Okay, Neil Bomberg, most U.S. cities do not provide enough affordable housing, shelter space or food to meet the needs of homeless people. Now, many have passed or are considering measures that target the homeless and the people who help them. Now, here's a few examples. In Philadelphia, it's illegal to hand out food outdoors unless you have a permit. It's illegal to keep belongings on public property or sleep outside in St. Petersburg, Florida. And Los Angeles has been handing out citations for anything from flicking the ash from a cigarette on the sidewalk or drinking in public. Advocacy groups have labeled it the country's meanest city. Are these cities mean?
Well, I'm not going to speak to what individual cities are doing. Individual cities will make their, their own decisions, following their own basic rules and guidelines and deciding what is appropriate. What I will say is that as a matter of policy across cities and towns across America, is that this is a huge problem that needs to be addressed. Our members are committed to addressing the problems of homelessness. They support efforts to eradicate homelessness. They support efforts to secure funding, especially from the federal government, for housing, for job training, for food programs, for social services. cities and towns, like the rest of the country, are facing huge economic problems, and when the federal government is not there to subsidize, support, assist, help out, it becomes very, very difficult for them to address this particular problem, as it is for them to address the full range of problems that the economically disadvantaged face. So I think it's unfair to say that cities are mean or ill-intended. I think they are trying to grapple with a very difficult problem in a way that they know best how to do it.
But is that the way to go, to outlaw homelessness?
Well, I don't think we're outlawing homelessness. I think what cities and towns are trying to do is respond to the diverse population within their cities. There are demands from all parts of the community for different services, for different approaches, different responses to problems. For example, ensuring that our parks are safe, that they're clean.
What you say is true, but this is the most vulnerable group, is it not?
Absolutely. There is no question that homeless people are amongst the most vulnerable, and there is no question that this is a very, very difficult and costly problem to address. And I think there's no question that some cities may be taking what are perceived as extreme actions, but again, they are responding in the way that they know best to respond.
Can I chime in here?
Go ahead, Jim. I'll get to you.
I just wanted to add to this conversation.
Yeah.
In Rhode Island, we specifically had a provision in our law that allows for non-criminalization of sleeping in public, but only when the shelter systems are full and when it's in an unobtrusive place. We weren't interested in making sleeping in public or pitching a tent in a public park illegal for homeless people. In fact, we wanted to avoid that type of debate. But two places in Rhode Island and two cities that may be members of the League, Newport, Rhode Island, and Providence, have solved this problem by, instead of enacting ordinance after ordinance prohibiting behaviors, trying to come together and figure out a collaborative way to address the issues in their cities, and acknowledging that the homeless population is there because we don't have comprehensive public policies to address the issue. And if we don't have comprehensive public policies to address the issue, then we've, in a sense, created this population of people. And we can't just dismiss them by creating laws that criminalize some of the options that they have no choice but to take.
Okay. Jeremy, you wanted to say?
Yeah, I'd like to just take on the argument that criminalization either actually solves the problem in homelessness in communities or actually reduces their costs. In fact, what we've seen over time is that criminalization costs money. When police have to spend their time handing out citations, when the judicial system has to deal with court cases, when people are incarcerated, those are costs that are imposed on communities. And what happens is then after somebody either gets a ticket or perhaps is briefly incarcerated, they're released again and they're right back on the street in the same community that they've been in all along. So in fact, criminalization is not helpful to actually solving the problem of homelessness in a downtown business community. It doesn't save cities money. There's really no reason that cities ought to be doing it. I think Jim has just offered us a great model from Rhode Island of cities who have realized this and have come together and said, we're going to look at a broader, more common sense approach.
Yeah, what about the point that Neil made as well, that there is no federal policy on this? I think the last law that was passed to tackle this kind of problem was way back in the 80s under the administration of President Reagan. Nothing has been done since on a federal level.
Well, the federal government is doing a number of things to address homelessness. There's no question that we've got the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness, which coordinates the work of federal agencies. The McKinney-Vento Act, which is the major federal law that you were referring to, was updated and reformed just 3 years ago. The major challenge we're facing right now that I'm sure Neil would agree with is we're seeing such dramatic cuts to affordable housing. So the HUD budget was reduced by approximately 10% last year.
That's housing and urban development.
Correct.
Right.
And we're anticipating, I think, a further loss of funding this year. Certainly no new funding
Right.
at a time when our needs are skyrocketing. So that's quite correct. We can't dispute that point. The question is, how are we going to respond to that at the local level? And these measures are simply not an effective response. So even where we have diminished resources, we really have to do a better job of getting people together at the local level to think about solutions that don't involve criminalization.
Okay.
And I would agree. I think there's no question that solutions that actually help homeless people move out of homelessness is the way that most cities and towns would wish to go. I think we have to be realistic, unfortunately, here. You're absolutely correct. The services are being cut in ways that are, we would argue, unconscionable. Workforce development programs are being cut 10 to 15 to 20%. Housing programs are being cut. Food services programs are being cut. Social services programs. The list goes on of the programs at the federal level that are being cut. And what is happening is that cities and towns are therefore gaining the responsibility to absorb those cuts and meet the fiscal or the financial demands to provide those services.
Right.
Unfortunately, they are in a worse place than the federal government. And so we have a situation where the responsibility for homelessness is being devolved to local governments, and yet local governments are incapable, unfortunately, as a rule, of meeting that demand from a financial perspective.
Has that been your experience, Jim? I mean, you pointed out earlier on that one of the problems that this problem faces is that there is no comprehensive public policy on it.
Right. In Rhode Island, we rely heavily on the federal government for the housing programs that Jeremy was describing. Like I said, we have no dedicated funding stream for the production of affordable housing in our state. We're one of the very few states that doesn't have it. So we rely on direct allocations or, like I said, an affordable housing bond that goes to the voters. Those are not the best ways to have a more comprehensive and long-term sustainable policy towards affordable housing production. You know, the economic downturn has really caused us in Rhode Island, and I think many other places, to think collaboratively and more cooperatively in how we deliver services to the homeless in our states and in our localities. The problem is, as we've gotten better and more efficient, we've grown into an efficiency that we can't grow into anymore. We're as efficient, I think, as we possibly can be, which is a good thing given the cutbacks. But now we need to move people into housing, and the housing just does not exist.
Yeah, go ahead.
I would just observe 2 points, I think. The first is that when we're in this situation and budgets are clearly being cut, and private charity wants to step up and try to provide what help they can, as churches and other groups are doing in a lot of these public feeding situations where church groups try to come down to the park. As you may know, they do this here in Washington, D.C., just around the corner at McPherson Square. It's really unfortunate to see cities actually trying to punish faith-based groups who are trying to step up and actually provide people with assistance. And then secondarily, to Jim's point, I just wanted to note, we have been trying to look at some creative solutions which involve taking the foreclosure crisis, which has obviously been a tremendous tragedy, and using that as an opportunity in the sense that in this country right now, we have a very large stock of foreclosed properties that are not currently being occupied. So we have a lot of housing without people living in it, and we have a lot of people without housing. We think the government should do something to help make sure that we can match up these people who don't have housing with vacant housing.
But there again, I guess it's a question of money, because, I mean, these, although they're foreclosed, these properties are worth something, and money is owed to somebody, some bank, somewhere. Neil, there is a legal aspect to this, where we have the Justice Department, which is investigating whether these laws that are being introduced by dozens of cities around the country, criminalizing homelessness, whether they actually violate people's human rights. And there's also one body of opinion that says that they may be violating aspects of the Constitution, the Fourth Amendment, for instance, which protects people against unreasonable search and seizure. You have the Eighth Amendment, which protects people against things like, it says, you engage in life activities where there is no public option. are cities going to have a problem with this?
Well, I think, as always is the case, cities will have to respond. If in fact the Justice Department finds that there is some violation, they will respond. They will adjust their laws accordingly. I think again, I would suggest that it is not the intent to violate their rights, but rather to find a balanced approach to a solution to homelessness as it is occurring in those cities. And where violations are occurring, they certainly should be addressed.
Okay. Let's take a look at some of the numbers that we're talking about here. Now, on any given night, there were over 630,000 homeless people in the United States in 2011. I should just add that, we cannot get an exact figure. It's very difficult to count the number of homeless people. The number of homeless people in the US has decreased slightly in recent years, largely due to federal programs that are set to expire this year. Most find spots in emergency shelters, but nearly 40% don't live in the streets, in cars, or in abandoned buildings. Families with children make up 37% of the homeless population. Between 2009 and 2010 alone, more than 1 million children experienced homelessness. And I want to add to that and say that, there were some figures that came out a couple of years ago, probably 3 years ago, which said that almost 40% of those people who are homeless are actually military veterans. Why are so many veterans homeless, Jeremy?
Yeah, it's really tragic that we have so many veterans who are homeless, and they really fall into two groups. One, of course, is more recent veterans who have just come home from the recent conflicts, and for a variety of reasons, including a lack of very strong supportive services to help them reintegrate into society, have lost touch with family and friends and become homeless. Then the other population of homeless veterans is really people who have been some of the more chronically homeless people who have been homeless for a very long time, perhaps even veterans from the Vietnam era, or from the 80s and 90s. So not all the veterans who are homeless are from the recent conflicts, but a number of them unfortunately are. And, I think it's just a reflection of, what we have talked about. We're simply not doing enough, whether it's providing mental health services, whether it's providing housing assistance, whether it's providing other types of help to help people get reacclimated from what they had to deal with when they were away at war to now having to come back and fit into our society. And we're just not doing enough, and as a result, too many vets are homeless.
Yeah. Jim Rysick, is there anything like a safety net for the homeless in the United States? I mean, do homeless people have access to, say, programs like the food stamp program? Do they have access to medical care?
Oh, sure. I mean, the SNAP program, the food stamp, formerly known as the food stamp program, is an entitlement program. So when you fall below a certain income, you automatically qualify for that program. Although the U.S. Congress is seriously looking at cuts to the SNAP program this year, which my colleague in Rhode Island, who runs the Rhode Island Food Bank, has called, crazy, ludicrous. This is a program that is meant to provide the basic sustenance for people who can't afford to feed themselves or their families. Likewise, medical care is guaranteed for people who can't afford or don't have insurance. The problem in this country, though, is that we spend far too much money on uncompensated care when we could probably save a huge percent of that cost by housing people. We've shown in Rhode Island through 2 empirical studies, when we house people who've been on the streets an average of 7.5 years, including the costs of supportive services, the housing, the cost to our state goes down by $8,000 per person. So they get a house, they get stabilized, and they have better outcomes for $8,000 less cost to the taxpayers than leaving them on the streets.
Okay.
And just to build on that point, there are really a couple of things. The first is that, unfortunately, while just about anybody who's homeless should qualify for SNAP or food stamp benefits, and often for Medicaid medical care, unfortunately, the bureaucratic systems in terms of being able to work their way through the application processes also mean that it's very, very difficult to do that. In many cases, people don't actually receive benefits that they're almost certainly qualified for based on their income. The other point is the healthcare decision that the Supreme Court is going to issue later this week is really going to be very important in this context, because the Affordable Care Act, the healthcare bill, contains within it an expansion of Medicaid coverage cover everyone at or below 130% of the poverty line. This would essentially ensure for the first time that probably virtually anybody who's homeless would have access to medical care. And if the Affordable Care Act is overturned by the Supreme Court, we're going to lose that, and that's going to be very significant.
Okay. Jeremy, thank you, and that's where we have to leave it, gentlemen. We've run out of time. Jeremy, Neil, and Jim, thanks to all of you for joining us for today's show. And that is it from the team here in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And of course, we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for being with us.